Folks, I'm Layman Pascal, and welcome back to Escaping the Educational Rut, part 17 of our 293-part episode series of asking Game B pioneer, network warrior, and quasi-philosopher Jim Rutt to speculate wildly about the educational crisis and the opportunities it may afford us. Now, I'm being half facetious, of course, but I do think education is one of the major choke points and or leverage points as humanity faces its multiple overlapping and accumulating crises. And who better to probe that territory with than a guy, smart, exuberant fellow who makes the concept of an old coot look good. It's Jim Rutt. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Layman. It's great for this old coot to be back on your podcast. It's always fun. You always ask good questions, always energizing. And sure as shit, education is a really critical topic, right? One we've talked about a fair bit on my podcast, The Jim Rutt Show, by the way. A little shameless pluggery there. And, when we think about, what really, it helps to step back and think, what is education actually in a good sense, right? Of course, it can be in a whole bunch of bad senses. Let's program people to be able to work efficiently on the assembly line, for instance, right? Which was kind of, some of the first public high schools in the late 19th, early 20th century. That was their motivation. But we think about it more broadly, and I will confess that I have been very strongly influenced by a fellow named Zach Stein. And he's got a wonderful book called Education in a Time Between Worlds, I think it's called. And so some of this is rehash Stein, and some of it is my own musings and ideas from other folks. But I think the essence, and this is one of the points that Zach does make, the essence of education is it is the necessary mechanism for intergenerational transfer of knowledge, culture, and everything, basically. And that's the important thing to consider, is that education, truly considered, broadly considered, is by its nature very broad. It's, not just facts and techniques. The Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts in 1620, and techniques. Here's how you do long division. But also, how do you deal with other people? What are the virtues that are important in your society? How do you learn to be to play in a multiplayer game, which is society, right? It's not a single player game. It's not Network Wars. It's a multiplayer game, and things like emotional intelligence and much more. And a narrow focus on facts and techniques is not truly the kind of education we need for the world we're confronting.
That is a great sort of general slice of, I think, what a lot of the problems are in the system we've got set up right now. And one of the things that's in there, or one of the implications of what you were just saying, is sort of the question, what do we want? Like, we can imagine an ongoing educational process, but we also have these sort of finite educational processes that we inflict upon or offer to the children. What's the goal? Like when you were saying, a person who's able to play multiple games or multipolar games, right? What else do we know, or what else do we hope about what the educational system produces? What do we want out the other end when we put somebody in for 12 or 16 or 20 years? What are we hoping to get, if not a factory worker?
Well, first I would challenge that we really need to grind away for, zillion hours a day for 20 years, right? A lot of research indicates that that's actually not anywhere near optimal. It was a very interesting research paper. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it this morning. I'll see if I can find it before I publish and put it up on your show notes. But by chance, there was a found experiment where a group of kids were not given any math education until they were 13 or 14. And then they were put into middle school math, and within a year they caught up. And consider how much time is spent in the sausage factory grinding away on math when people are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It may turn out to be a complete waste of time. In that the facts and techniques necessary to know middle school non-algebraic math may be able to be taught in a year when you're 14. And so it seems to me that we want to think optimally about how we bring in these things for an intergenerational transfer. But to your bigger question of what we want a person to be, in some sense, I go all the way back to Aristotle, right? I want them to be a good citizen, whatever that means, right? It means a lot of things. It means having facts and techniques, but it also means And I should say, and then it also very much the Aristotelian model includes virtues, right? And some of that is, how to be on an assembly line and be a worker, be reliable, be conscientious, be accurate, be truthful, etc. But a lot of the other things are, how to respect other people, how to be able to defuse conflict in life. I mean, there will always be conflict in life. And rather than going on throwing a tantrum and I gotta have it my way, learning to be able to think through from the other person's perspective and to engage in, what I recommend is rule omega, which is to assume the other person is trying to make sense, unless you're, fundamentally have very strong evidence that they're not. And so these kinds of cognitive, social, interpersonal techniques. So I go back to the wideness of it as really what we're trying to accomplish. Good citizen, broadly construed.
Right. Good citizenship. You and I have talked before about the kinds of projects and genres of economic and cultural activity in which Game B type people might naturally outperform conventional approaches. It seems to me education might be one of those areas because, there's a sense of how minds work. There's a sense of collaboration. There's a sense of critique of systems. Does it seem to you like education is one of the areas where Game B thinking might have an edge?
We think so. And as we're starting to move to actually plan and even in some cases build proto B on the ground communities, how we're going to deal with education is something that's right front and center in our design stack. And our thinking is that we ought to be able to do a way better job. Now, of course, we run into a problem of resourcing, especially in the United States. Most of the money goes into the sausage factory public school system. There are some side alternatives of charter schools and such, and so that makes it appealing to see if you can use the charter schools, but they're actually fairly rigid. It may well be that we'll just jump out and say, all right, we'll take on the full cost in our community of doing true Game B education. We suspect that there is huge rooms for improvement in many ways, not just getting the skills and virtues, but also the mental health. One of the things you look at the trajectory over my lifetime. One of the advantages of being an old coot, so-called, is that I've seen a fair amount of change since I was a lad back in the late 50s and early 60s when I was in elementary school. And in those days, we actually had a fair amount of free play at school, so-called recess. In fact, I have said it publicly that with respect to my business career, I learned more at recess than I did in the classroom, probably at least up till grade 6, right? I learned how to lead. I learned how to follow. I learned how to organize. I learned how to attack organizations, coalition politics. I mean, constant battles on the playground in those days. In those days, they let you fight, which was good, right? Now, the goddamn mamby-pamby teachers won't let kids fight. I mean, a 10-year-old boy, that's what they were evolutionary designed to do, is spar with other 10-year-old boys, right? And if you can't do that, you're not developing as a full person. So I think that there has been, I don't think the sausage factory was all that good in 1963, when I would have been in 4th grade. But I think it's gotten a lot worse since, right? Everything I hear from schools today is that there's less free time for true free play. And to the degree there is free play, it's very highly supervised. No kid gangs, right? No this, no that. No throwing rocks at hornets' nests. All the things that you did. And you learn, don't get too close to a hornet's nest. You can throw a rock at it. That's a useful learning, and applies not just to throwing rocks at hornets' nests, but in dealing with business and government, and the police, and everything else, right? So I think those are some very important things. And then also, I think this idea of education being very broad, the idea of unstructured play outside of school is even more important. And, I will say I learned way more from the vast number of hours spent in unstructured play as a kid outside of school than I did even in recess in school. So I think it's very important to think of education holistically in that sense. And if we're designing a Game B education environment, it's going to thoughtfully consider all those things. How much formal schooling, how much time spent on facts and techniques versus how much time spent on play. And the other area I'm a strong believer in, I'm not sure everybody in Game B land is, but I think every kid should learn a manual craft. Carpentry, bricklaying, tile work, leather work, calligraphy, almost doesn't matter what it is, but learn some skill in great depth over a period. First experiment and try several crafts when you're, say, 8 or 9. And by the time you're 10 or so, or maybe 11, you choose a craft that is your craft. And then thereafter, you spend some significant amount of time with exposure to experts, with masters, to actually get at least decent at bricklaying or leather work or sewing or whatever it happens to be, so that everyone has a tangible physical set of skills that interact with the physical world. And that's something that, again, that it's really easy in today's educational environment to miss entirely. You basically live in the virtualized world of signs and symbols. And even worse, these days, in admittance to higher education, it's only about your skills in signs and symbols that gets you into the so-called elite universities and generates the so-called leaders of tomorrow. And we wonder why they're narrow, grinding sociopaths, right? We're selecting for that. So let's not do that.
All right. So we've got a need for extended, depth-oriented, world-encountering craft education. We've got a need for more unstructured access to natural interpersonal complexity, which the current systems may be over managing and squelching. And we've got this sense that the focus is too narrow and needs to be much broader. Now, my guess is if you went into educational institutions and talked to administrators and teachers, they would broadly agree with a lot of this stuff. They might even say, yeah, we're trying to inculcate mental health and virtues and give people practical skills. But then the question becomes, why isn't it working? Like, what are the common problems in actually instantiating this if you can get agreement from a lot of teachers that these are the kinds of things that are important for development?
That's a great question. There's lots of problems. Let's start with the question of virtues, right? And let's say in the United States example, typically the curriculum is set at the state level, millions of people. And the idea of what virtues to emphasize and how much emphasis to put on virtues in general then becomes a compromise across millions of people, many of them from different cultural traditions, et cetera. And so it ends up being watered down pablum, right? Anything that's going to make 7 million people, state of Virginia, not unhappy, all of them essentially, or most of them, is going to be pablum. So again, I think the education fits very, very nicely with the Game B philosophy of bottom up, coevolution essentially and emergence, in that things like the virtues to be taught at the school at a proto B would be decided by the 150 people at the proto B, right? And there may be there's always going to be horizontal communications amongst the lowest level of the community and say, all right, we found this works over here and this works over here, but we don't have to water everything down to pablum. We can take a point of view. And, bottom-up education organized at the level of the face-to-face community at the Dunbar number of 150 people will be much more point of view than the soft cereal that has to be served to keep 7 million people from no considerable minority of 7 million people from rebelling. I think that's a big part of it. And the other are essentially institutional designs that emerged in higher education or lower K-12 education in particular. And that's the notorious teaching to the test. When you talk to teachers, and I know some teachers, my wife was a teacher, the bane of public school education today is this mandatory teaching to the test. And it was a Campbell's law, I think it is, that anything that is rigorously measured soon becomes a worthless measure of what it was trying to measure, right? And if there was no testing and you just came in and sprung tests on everybody, the test would actually be probably fairly decent at seeing what people learn. But once you say we're going to do testing every year and people start to be able to figure out what's going to be in the tests and that there's payback incentives, career incentives, promotion opportunities, bonuses now in some school systems for doing good on the standardized test, guess what? Teaching becomes how to game the test rather than how to do real education. So I think, especially in the United States, I know less about other countries. The idea of teaching to the test has been grossly bad in undermining the real efforts to whole student education. Yeah, and by the way, there's nothing on these tests for interpersonal emotional intelligence, or how to form and operate in teams as both a leader and a follower. There's nothing like that on these tests, right? And how could there be? You can't standardize number 2 pencil on filling in the little bubbles and explore these kinds of areas. So I think those are at least 2 of the big issues.
I love this idea of sort of random testing. It seems like it would dramatically increase the anti-fragility of the understanding.
Yeah, exactly. And it'd still be useful to have metrics, but let's say that you literally rolled some electronic dice and you just sampled, and no one knew when or where, and it's at a sufficiently low frequency that there's no career incentives. Further, I would say that there should never be personal accountability back to the school of the teacher for these tests, because if you make them high stakes, Campbell's law comes into effect, right? But yet, as a society, we may want to know how our schools are doing along certain dimensions. And so there's ways to reform the idea very radically. Much less testing, much more random, and not personally accountable.
Well, let's talk about how we could do different kinds of evaluations then, because if teaching to the tests and the kinds of things that are on tests provide us with not only a faulty metric, but also a distorted educational process, how do we go about evaluating A, how people are doing in symbolic and knowledge tasks, and B, how they're doing in the other kinds of skill building that you can't necessarily capture on a paper test? What are we looking for to make sure it's working?
Well, I think one is you can build in, essentially real-time, constant, small bits of assessment, right? Let's, imagine again our math work, right? As you're doing your homework, et cetera. So let's say it's being input at least into the computer. We can actually see how the kids are doing, and in real time and in real context. And we can also see cross correlations. Oh, the kid's performance has fallen down a little bit in math, but it's also fallen down in speech and spelling and science. Something going on in the kid's life, probably not having to do with the actual details of learning math, right? And this is where Zach is very strong on the concept of teacherly authority, that at the end of the day, to really assess where the kid is, you're going to need a human to do that assessment. And if we think about the role of the teacher in modern, postmodern, meta-modern education, it may well be much less about standing in front of the class and lecturing than it will be about doing assessment, doing one-on-one interventions when those assessments show that the kids have some holes in what they're doing. So I think while we can use some technology to help gather as people are working how they're doing, rather than saying, we're doing a test, April 2021, right? And then secondly, you got to have good humans in the loop, I think, is a very important part of it.
I mean, yeah.
I was going to go off on one other thing in the introductory area that we didn't get to, which I think is hugely important when thinking about education as a social institution. And this is one of my favorite topics, which applies. It's a lens that applies almost everywhere, but it really applies here. When we're thinking about the role of education in a society, I think a key thing is there's the usual trade-off between coherence and stability and the movement towards the new, right? And that's something that, again, I don't hear people talk about with respect to public school education. We want to have some coherence so people have some shared values, both within an age cohort, but also within the current mores of society. And we want some stability. But, that's a real easy way to end up like the, Chinese in the 15th century, where they had a very rigid Mandarin, Confucian, exam-based system, and their society essentially ground to a halt. We want to have the ability for the education system to encourage people to explore away from current thinking, and even challenge current virtues. Probably pretty high standard on challenging core virtues, but at least put in people's minds that you have to explore, and that getting this balance between coherence and exploration, or what we call in evolutionary computation, exploitation versus exploration, I think is a really hugely important, almost top of the food chain parameter that when we're thinking about the role of education in society.
So there's a kind of, tension that has to be balanced there between what we currently understand and where we need to get this consolidated coherence so that we have enough in common to function together in a society, and the novelty and exploration that we need in order to challenge ourselves and challenge systems and discover things going forward. But what's the role of the past in all that? Like, how important is, say, the study of classics or some kind of extended continuity of our knowledge in terms of establishing that coherence? Because I think one of the things that studying classics, studying arcane things, studying previous civilizations, or keeping up a continuity over multiple centuries in the curriculum helps to challenge whatever the current beliefs are, because it puts us in contrast to what's been going on in the past. But it also provides an important stabilizing feature, it seems like.
And it also provides some important vocabulary elements, right? Think about how radically embedded in the cultural traditions of the last 300 years, the Bible and Shakespeare are, right? I'm pretty well known as a militant atheist, but I've read the Bible cover to cover twice, and every 10 years I reread the first 5 books, the Decalogue, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Hebrew Bible, plus the 6th one, Joshua. As I always say, if you're going to read the joke, you got to get to the punchline. And Joshua is essentially the punchline of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So I read that every 10 years, did it last year. And they go, why would a bloody-minded atheist know so much about the Bible? Well, because the Bible is a whole bunch of mimetic particles that we use when we communicate with each other. From everything from the golden rule to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, etc. And so I think it's this idea of having a curated set of classics, which most people are familiar with, is really important for a bunch of reasons. I like the additional argument. I'm not sure how often I've heard that, but I think it's really true. The idea that reading, let's say, Cicero or Tacitus, the Romans in particular, you're being put in touch with a pretty sophisticated society, but one that is like radically and extremely different than ours. Where leading citizens think it's perfectly good entertainment to go to the Colosseum and see prisoners torn apart by lions, right? Or the idea that the head of the family literally has the power of life or death over all the children, the slaves, everybody else, where slavery is just absolutely part of life, et cetera. And seeing these alien but fairly sophisticated societies is really a pretty interesting and head-turning experience. And it's, again, to my mind, one of the truly important things in all forms of education, not just K-12, but lifetime, and that which is our social infrastructure is created by humans. This did not come down from Mount Sinai with Moses, right? This is all stuff humans invented along the way, and hence humans can change.
The rereading of the Bible is fascinating because it brings up for my mind something that's a little bit similar to the notion of an ongoing chosen craft in education, because there's something we gain from sampling things, right? Trying different crafts, reading new books, and there's something else we gain by rereading or continuing in the same genre of skill development, let's say. Because if we want to gauge depth as opposed to just knowledge acquisition, it's almost like the only way we can do that is by returning to the same material and understanding it in a new way. And I worry that there's not any real rereading at all, right? You don't reread a book in grade 12 that you read in grade 10 that you read in grade 7. So there's no sense that people are being encouraged or placed in a context where they're going to understand more than they understood before about the same thing.
Damn good point. I personally am a bit of a rereader. As I said, I reread the first 6 books of the Bible every 10 years. I read the Bible cover to cover twice. And I suppose most famously, I've read Lord of the Rings 30 times, right? But there's other books I've reread as well. And I do think you make a very good point there. In fact, I'm going to actually think about that, whether that ought to be something that a Game B education ought to do. Pick a book, and probably doesn't even matter that much what it is, so long as it's rich. I'll give you another example of a book I reread regularly, which is before I start any long writing project, I reread Aristotle's Poetics, which is, kind of rigid, kind of formulaic. On the other hand, sort of listening to someone think through the issues of how to write probably for the first time, truly systematically, it's just mind blowing. So I always do that every time I start a long writing. It's a short little book, you can read it in like an hour and a half. So there's a good example. What happens if we had people starting reading the Poetics when they were first able to do so, say at age 10, and reread it every 2 years as they're developing their writing skills. And then maybe in 12th grade, 13th grade, we have a course on Aristotle's Poetics and weave it into the writing that we do, as an example.
I think the quality of richness, you're right, is absolutely essential here. This may be somewhat mythologized, but I remember being taught about the reintroduction of literacy in the court of Charlemagne. And they brought in this guy, Alcuin of York, and they were going to teach the children of nobility to read. And this hadn't been going on for several centuries. And what they had to teach them with was essentially the Bible and the Greek classics. And that's so different than an age-appropriate reader, right? So you're going to, on the one hand, you give someone really rich, complex material, and you expect they're going to incompletely understand what they're reading, and that's okay, versus this kind of commercial, contemporary, graduated fashion where we only give them the material we think they'll be able to easily understand and master, and then they buy another book for the next year and another book for the next year. That seems like two completely divergent paths in terms of education.
Yeah, though you would have to really work through that. My guess, based on my knowledge of cognitive science, is it probably is not a good idea to start a 5-year-old with Cicero. No. They just, now, on the other hand, if you didn't do any education at all, other than some of the very, very basics till kids were 11 or 12, yeah, you could read. An 11-year-old could read Cicero and understand it, but a 5-year-old can't. So if you conclude that you want to begin the education in literacy at a young age, then I suspect that a more cognitively science-informed approach of using a level of vocabulary, a length of words, a complexity of sentence structure, et cetera, and this is areas that are pretty well studied, probably makes more sense.
Yeah, there's obviously got to be a good fit between the cognitive capacity and the complexity of the material. At the same time, I think we've developed an educational culture in which if people don't get it easily, we treat that as a problem. When it should be okay for even fairly young children to read things and be frustrated that they don't understand it all and can't follow all of it. We have a certain kind of weakness. We're like, oh no, we better give them something simpler because they're not getting it.
Yeah, and of course, if you're teaching to the test, that mitigates against that. Oh, I want the kids to get 95% understanding. Well, an 11-year-old reading Aristotle is not going to have 95% understanding, nor should they. But if they have 75% understanding, that's miraculous and puts them on the way to developing a very rich understanding. And it's actually a place to insert another concept, which I think I read first about in the work of Hansi Freinack, so-called, and also learned more about it in reading Zach Stein. And that's the idea of hierarchical complexity. I think another very important attribute of Game B education is to help people move up the stack of hierarchical complexity. People say, what the hell is hierarchical complexity? I'll just use the word complexity itself, right? When you and I talk about complexity, I say complexity, we both have a fairly similar picture of a whole bunch of things, of emergence and agent-based simulations and high dimensionality and network structures, et cetera. On the other hand, probably the majority of Americans, you talk to them about complexity, they think it's the same thing. It's complicated, right? A watch is complex. No, it's not. It's actually complicated. But the fact that you and I have a similar, very rich, very nuanced understanding of the word complexity is the sign that we're operating, at least in that domain, and only in that domain, at a high level of hierarchical complexity. And choosing where to develop hierarchical complexity and make it a common attribute of society is a hugely important part of education. I happen to also have very much hierarchical complexity around computer technology. I actually know what's going down at the bits, literally below the bits and bytes at the chip level. Most people don't need to know that. There's no real reason to teach hierarchical complexity with respect to information technology, but with respect to deep ideas, the scientific method, right? I certainly wish we were doing a better job of teaching hierarchical complexity about the scientific method so that people actually had a realistic understanding of what science is and isn't, right? For instance, a person's a charlatan when someone says science proves X, right? Science, if you actually understand the scientific method at a high level of hierarchical complexity, science is a methodology, a ratchet, and that by the rules of science, every statement in science is provisional, waiting for somebody to disprove it, right? So to say that science proves X, essentially, the only thing it proves is that you're not a scientist, right? So choosing where to develop shared hierarchical complexity is, I think, a gigantic part of fitting education into society.
Yeah, and getting the balance right between complexity in one area and complementary complexity in another area seems really important, because when we're talking about developing complexity of understanding in science, part of that is how we're being taught science, and part of it is another set of emotional skills and perspective taking skills and things like that that make you come into science with the assumption that it's obviously going to be more sophisticated than a simple dogma that you can assert about the world. That might be a skill set from another area of complexity development. So that intrigues me, is how do the different elements of curriculum interact with each other? Because right now they're very, very modular, it seems like, right? There's no real, what physicality do we bring to mathematics? Almost none. But our, Pythagoras was working with stones and drawing geometry in the dirt. That's a very embodied procedure.
Yeah, in fact, some of the best scientific writing on how we learn to read and write is happening in cognitive science. A particular guy I like is Stanislas Dehaene. He's a French cognitive scientist. He and his wife are both cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, and they work with young children. And, he makes the point he wrote a really good book about how we learn math, basically arithmetic. And he makes the point on how grounded that really is, right? And that a lot of it starts with estimating. Is this pile bigger than that pile? If so, how much? A little bit or a lot, right? And they also demonstrate that some animals have some rudimentary quantitative capabilities as well. And one of the implications of their work is, particularly for very young children, manipulating stones and things is probably a very good way to take advantage of what was already genetically built in before you start teaching the formalisms. And of course, a lot of us remember that and our teachers tried to suppress it, but I was a great one for doing math by counting on my fingers under the table, right? And frankly, I would encourage that, anything that works. And the more we understand our genetic / cognitive science heritage, I think the more it's pointing out, particularly for young children, people trying to get the concept that dealing with the physical is actually a good idea.
That notion of our genetic and cognitive heritage, and also the complexity of embodied human brains and social situations, and the way we now understand systems that learn is so different than what we thought 20 years, 50 years ago, 80 years ago. It seems like there's a tremendous lag between the institutions we've set up and our knowledge of how systems learn.
Oh, it's maddening. And I actually dabbled in that a little bit about 8 or 9 years ago. I was trying to help the University of Virginia set up a PhD program in cognitive science. And we got buy-in from amazing breadth from the medical school, from the engineering school, from the psychology department, which was going to be the core, even from the business school. You know, what's the one place that we didn't get any buy-in? The School of Education, right? They're famously 40 or 50 years behind in taking the knowledge that is, as you point out, especially in the last 30 years, it's just been exponential in how we learn, and what parts are pre-programmed and what parts are subject to reprogramming, and all this sort of stuff it's miserable, it's horrible, and it's bad that our schools of education, which then train our teachers, are frankly aggressively rejecting modern learning and cognitive science, which is nuts.
When you were talking about the narrowness of the educational approach and the goal of producing a virtuous, generally functional citizen, it made me think that there's a lot of areas that really ought to be or might be included within our educational system that are currently not treated as education. For example, prisons and the idea of reforming an individual to make them a better citizen is somewhat analogous to what we're hoping to do then with children. Or immigration is like that. We're going to bring someone in and we hope that through a series of processes, they become what we want to have as a good citizen. Like how broadly can education be applied? And what are the areas of society that are really educational problems and we don't treat them as or think of them as educational problems?
Very, very, very good point. In that, if thought correctly, if education is pervasive across our society, right? There's, the examples you give, reform in prisons, right? Certainly an educational problem, at least ought to be. More and more they're just treated as lock them up, keep them off the streets. But at least in theory, one ought to be able to help re-educate people. Imagine things like the virtues, self-control, focus, etc., could be very helpful to help people reintegrate. And with immigration, you have similar issues, though there, some of it's going to be about, all right, how do we think about, how does the new society think about things versus the old society? And of course, there's a tension there that I think in modern societies, at least, we don't believe we need to, bend and break the immigrant to be exactly like us. We want them to be able to choose what they want to adopt of ours. Though some core things they must adopt of ours, but leave some room for them to have, some of the flavor of their culture. And some of that will bleed into our culture and make our culture richer. So again, those are educational programs, but I think you have to, especially that immigration one, think about with some real nuance. Another area that to expand on your question, that current K through 12 education and higher education doesn't do hardly at all, is focus on low-level cognitive skills. Think about things like doing mindfulness meditation and learning how to concentrate and control the jabberings in your brain, things of that sort. There's a whole array of low-level, non-verbal even cognitive skills, which could be very useful and should be part probably of educations at all parts of the life cycle.
That's a really important point, I think, and maybe we should dig into that a little bit more, because I heard a story that some years ago, a project called Tools of Mind introduced some early elementary school alternatives in a New York system. And what they did was they taught extended play as a precursor to extended thinking. And they also taught nuanced discrimination. So rather than having kids write the letter A 100 times, they had to write it 10 times and decide which one was the best one. So they're using these extension and detail and nuanced evaluation mechanisms. And it turned out these kids sort of shot forward several grade levels in terms of the metrics they were using. And the program was shut down because it was deemed unfair to the kids who weren't in the program, even though the program was not subsequently then implemented for all the kids. But it seems like that's an example of some of these proto skills that are necessary to engage and galvanize general cognitive development. So what is your sense of what are some of those proto skills? What are these low level capacities that really set the whole thing in motion?
Yeah, I got to admit, I am not an expert in this domain, so I'm just going to be bullshitting here. So let's be clear. For whatever reason, my explorations of cognitive science haven't actually gone into that particular corner. But I would suggest, attention is huge, right? Of course, you got to be careful. It's not natural for a 5-year-old to be able to have, deep and long attention, but you can do some attention exercises and, let the attention they have be stronger. Let them be less distracted at the micro level. I like the one about discernment and curation. I hadn't thought about that one. That's a very interesting skill. Develop the skill to have perspective and make decisions based on non-explicit criteria. The idea of write a bunch of letters and choose which one you think is the most like B. That's kind of an interesting exercise, right? The ability to, this does come from more formal science, is doing things in your head is actually very useful. You learn them in a much more solid way. For instance, rotating surfaces in your head. There are games, you can make this fun, all right, which one of these will plug into that, right? And you essentially have to rotate a 3-dimensional object or start with a 2-dimensional object and say, okay, this one does, but this one doesn't. And doing that a bunch rather than, once every 5 years in an IQ test will actually increase your ability to do, spatial temporal manipulations in your head. I'm also a great believer, even though this is so old school, damn, Rutt, you are a geezer. I think mental arithmetic is hugely important, to be able to at least come up to an order of magnitude on a calculation without using a calculator or even a pencil and paper is a hugely valuable skill. So that you, particularly so you get the right range of a number. So you have a sense of its about big, we're talking millions here or thousands, right? Doing that mentally, I found that people who can do mental math are more fluid thinkers in a broad array of disciplines, not just mathematical ones. So I think those are some examples. What else would fit into that area of low-level cognition that's generalizable? Gestalt psychology. Here's a good one. Getting people to become aware of the concept of foregrounding and backgrounding is really interesting. And I could imagine some exercises where you show people to modulate their focus between the foreground and the background. This also comes from cognitive science research. Western people tend to put more emphasis on the foreground than they do on the background. Well, again, this is a cliche and it's broad, but the scientific research does support it. People from East Asia in particular tend to put more attention on the background relative to the foreground than Westerners do. And they have certain skills that come from that that we don't have. Well, we have some skills that they don't have, which comes from being more strongly foregrounded. And so experimenting with foregrounding and backgrounding and modulating that, I suspect would give people a very interesting low-level cognitive skill that they could apply to all kinds of things. And you could teach that to a 4-year-old, right? I could have that discussion with my granddaughter in 2 more years, and I'm pretty confident that we could actually come up with something, that would do that. So there's another example. But again, keep in mind, I'm just making this shit up. So
yeah, I think that's a really good observation, Jim, because it really would set you up for intentional attention and perspective switching in many ways down the road. One thing that just popped into my mind is sort of your life, which is to say, how would I put this? You've been fortunate or maybe strategic to spend time with some of the smartest, most interesting, most potentially socially useful people around. Do you have any observations about their educational backgrounds? Do you see any commonalities in their educational histories or their personal learning strategies? People who impress you as being really competent and smart and useful?
Yeah, and you're right. I have had a libido for those people, right, since I was quite young. And why did I quit business and go to the Santa Fe Institute? And I said, because business is a mile wide and an inch deep. The best scientists are an inch wide and a mile deep, right? And the people at Santa Fe Institute, they're a mile wide and a mile deep, right? These are some amazing sons of bitches. So that's a great question. When I think back of the people I know who I found myself drawn to because of the powers of their personal intellectual and personal skills. One thing that does come back in almost every case is they first learned one thing very deeply. They were really good at X, but they were not monomaniacal about it. They were also very good at Y. They self-taught Y, Z, A, B, C. So self-teaching, depth in one thing, and then a lifelong commitment to self-education, I would say. When I think about, the people I know who are just most exemplary, they have had the discipline to master something in great depth, but they've always spent a significant part of their personal development budget learning other things. And in fact, now that it reminds me, that was one of my interviewing questions when I was back hiring, top grade people into my companies. One of the questions I'd love to ask was, what's the thing you most recently taught yourself that had nothing to do with work, right? And often the answer was nothing. And then it was, and so the ability to self-learn is, to my mind, from a base of knowing at least one thing deeply, is, to my mind, the hallmark of the people I have found personally most interesting in my life.
And these people, including but not limited to Zach Stein, many of them must have comments and criticisms about education generally. I wonder what you feel like you've heard a lot from different people who you respect in terms of what they think the education system needs or where it's insufficient.
Well, that's basically everything we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I think that's really what we've been talking about. And again, I'm not an expert in education, and so essentially, I'm channeling the things I've heard from people who know a lot more about this than I do. Is there any biggest single takeaway that we could talk about here? I think all the people that think about education well think about it way more broadly than sitting in a classroom for 6 hours a day. I think they all agree that the current form of teaching for the test is a horribly bad idea. I think they would all agree that more focus on basic cognitive tools would have huge payoff, particularly if it starts earlier. I think people would differ on your and my sense that having a canon of classics that everybody knew and that we regularly revisited, I would say that's not necessarily a unanimous view of people who thought deeply about education. And I'd say that people also differ some on how important a teacher is in the loop. I mean, particularly this is Zach Stein's lodestone. This is where he goes. Teacherly authority is absolutely indispensable. And I suppose I didn't start with that perspective, but having listened to him a lot now, I'm coming around on that there's some special skill called being a teacher, right? And being exposed to people who are good teachers is probably very helpful in this mission we call education.
Yeah, you probably at the very least need to see an actual human being template higher levels of complexity than the one you're operating with.
Yeah, that's interesting and hugely important, and also very difficult, particularly in our goddamn society that's becoming so hierarchical and so bimodal. I mean, essentially in the United States, if you either went to a 4-year college or you're being ground to dust, right? And you're living in a very different place without interface to other people. And so you're not getting the social modeling of hierarchical complexity or these cognitive skills that we're talking about nearly as much as you used to when people were much more mixed up. And so I think this problem is bad and getting worse.
Are there any specific educational projects that you know about that strike you as interesting or promising?
Well, some friends of mine ran a project called Raw Learning, which was very interesting. And it was essentially a schooling system. It was really an unschooling school system, but one that had some structure to it. And, they encouraged kids to, if kids wanted to fight, I keep coming back, but they had boxing gloves and put them in a ring, let them fight, right? All the boys had pocket knives by the time they were 10. Learning crafts was part of what they did. They had outside people come in from various domains and talk about what they did to, and let the kids interact with them in a very rich way for a couple hours. So that was a really interesting project, and unfortunately, kind of fell apart when these two folks moved on from it. And it wasn't institutionalized enough. The whole point was not to be institutionalized, but it was not institutionalized enough to carry on. I think actually of the canned programs, Montessori education is actually a quite good one. There's a lot of good things going on there, very much focused on hands-on, particularly for younger children. Some of it's a little doctrinaire. Oh, you can't do this, can't do that. I don't tend to be so doctrinaire about such things. But in terms of other things, I'm not really fully aware of anything what I'd call a comprehensive Game B educational system that has addressed all the things that we've talked about. How about you? Do you know any such things?
Yeah, I'm aware of a few projects, but they all seem to be just in the conceptual formatting stage at the moment. But it's hard to say. I mean, I talked recently to Creston Davis from the Global Center for Advanced Studies. They have some very interesting things going on there. There's this thing they're trying to set up in Texas, the Wild Vessel Project.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's Forrest Landry's an advisor on that. Zach Schlosser and a couple of people down there doing some interesting things.
So what was the name of that again?
Wild Vessel.
Wild Vessel. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, I think they're just templating their first module at the moment, but the idea is to have sort of alternative teachers collaborating with each other in a way that could potentially be scalable. Yeah. So there's a couple of those things, but they're all still in the promising phase rather than the manifest stage.
Yeah, in my conversation with Zach, Zach Stein clearly has some ideas, but he's a philosopher, not necessarily a builder. And so he lays them out to the world, and hopefully somebody will run with them and try to bring some of these things into being, and be balanced between the various elements that we've talked about today. Probably being monomaniacally obsessed with any one of them is a mistake. And then the other one I always often stress is let us design these things with a light touch, realizing we're almost certainly wrong. That's the other problem we talked about why is K through 12 education 50 years behind on cognitive science, because they have the tendency to believe they have the answers. God damn it, right? And when you take a dogmatic approach to something as complex, truly complex as education, that's a bad idea. This has got to be empirically grounded with an experimental mindset that we're going to do the best we can with version A, but realize we're not right. And we're going to continually tinker with it, make it better, do experiments in parallel. Again, this bottoms up approach of validating things at the low level and then let it bubble up through horizontal communication strikes me as especially appropriate to the question of education and how education is embedded in society as a truly organic part.
The question of where aggression fits into this is very interesting, because I can see people pushing back on your your idea that the kids should be able to fight. And there's clearly some ways to get aggression wrong in educational systems. We don't want to be training neo-Nazis, and we don't want to have excessive bullying. But at the same time, there's a kind of phobic anti-aggression stance that a lot of civilized educational systems seem to have now, where there's absolutely no acknowledgement and no training, and signs of aggression, particularly in the boys, seem like they're signs of a pathology that needs to be quashed rather than an instinct that needs to be cultivated somehow. And that, I think, connects to some of these concerns around like the fragility of reactive woke culture, let's say, because one project that they're trying to set up, this University of Austin project.
Yeah, very familiar with that.
Very interesting. They're going to bring back a kind of classic sense of humanities and tech, and they're going to try to create spaces that are safe from attacks by people who think that this might be socially problematic, unjust, or too aggressive in some way. And I'm curious, right? They seem to really feel like that the American higher education facilities are under siege by hysterical versions of social justice and moral sensitivity. Do you think that's as big a problem as they seem to think it is?
I would say, fuck yes. It's a huge problem. And I'd say a great book to read. And they're involved with the University of Austin project is a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, by Greg Lukianoff, who's going to be on my podcast in February, and Jonathan Haidt, who's one of the founder of the Heterodox Academy. This is a huge problem in our society, this idea of wimpy ass safety first, right? It's fucking nuts, right? And you can probably guess where I come in on this with respect to aggression. I think aggression is good, right? But on the other hand, it also has to be virtuous aggression. The idea of bullying, for instance, is absolutely reprehensible. The strong should protect the weak. They should never exploit the weak. That's the virtue of the knight going all the way back to the 12th century. And so both sides of that, need to be taught. And you say specifically for boys, look at the social pathology of boyhood in public schools today. It sucks. Donkey dicks. It's terrible. If I had a boy, I would really be loath to send him to the public school for the attempt to squash boyness, right? Boys are, not all, of course, everything's on a statistical distribution, but way to the other side are into rough play, aggression, establishing friendships around people they've been in fights with, all those sorts of stuff. And to try to squash human nature in that way is horribly deforming. And look at the results. Boys now are just falling grossly behind in education. 60% of bachelor's degrees are now issued to women in the United States. Now, it's a damn good thing that it's not the other way, where it used to be a third of bachelor's degrees went to women. But why isn't it 50-50? Why have we gone so far to essentially disempower boyness in this very wimpy ass fucking way? I hate that shit, right? And I'm recently run into this kind of safetyism at my alma mater, MIT. Where it's been in the news a fair bit. The MIT administration disinvited a speaker. It was a scientific talk on exoplanet atmospheres. And, I've actually seen the talk. He gave it in a different venue. Very good and very nerdy, right? Nothing to do with politics at all. Well, it turned out this guy had written and with a co-author had written an essay for Newsweek magazine, basically opposing thumbs on the scale forms of affirmative action in academic hiring, the so-called equity word that we hear about. And he and his writing partners have laid out an alternative called merit, fairness, and equality. They go into some detail and distinguish two. And whether you agree with Dorian Abbott or the diversity, equity, and inclusion folks, his point of view is certainly a legitimate one. In fact, in a recent Pew survey, 75% of Americans agreed that you should always hire the best person for a job, even if it negatively impacts diversity. So, whether you agree or disagree with Dorian Abbott, his idea is certainly well within the American mainstream. But the MIT, some students, as you can imagine, got on Twitter and go, oh, no, we can't have somebody who has an idea different than ours speak on campus about exoplanet atmospheres. And the goddamn cowardly administration has kowtowed and actually banned him. So we've started, a group of us, and I was one of the co-founders, have started a new organization called MIT Free Speech Alliance. And it's amazing the number of faculty, students, alums who have signed up for this thing. And, we are, and especially the more we dig in, the more absurd this whole thing has turned out to become. In fact, for instance, faculty did a poll on faculty fora on free speech. We were all shocked. Do you feel on an everyday basis that your voice or the voices of your colleagues are constrained at MIT? Between 52 and 60% of faculty members voted yes on an everyday basis. Your voice or your voices, your colleagues are constrained at MIT. And we've dug into this further and further. What it appears to be is the administration reacting to the hypersensitive students. That's the energy. So something has gone vastly wrong in the education of an awful lot of students, even at the most elite universities, that they can't tolerate an idea of which they disagree, even second order being on their campus. Again, the talk was about exoplanet atmospheres. And the guy disagreed with him about thumbs on the scale forms of affirmative action. And the little darlings had a shit fit, right? What the hell kind of thing is going wrong in their education?
Yeah, it does seem like there probably is a strong correlation between the lack of training and experience around aggression, the lack of turning aggression into an interpersonal intelligence, and this inability to tolerate upsetting points of view or to be friends with people we don't like, so to speak.
Yeah, it's disgusting. The another example about all this, one of my people I've met through my podcast who has become a friend is just as wonderful a fellow as I know on the face of the earth. We joke with each other, we must be brothers from another mother. It was Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an indigenous Australian fellow, as he would call himself, a black fellow, right? Which in Australian means Aboriginal. And, he and I've chatted on the air and privately about the amazing initiation rituals for young people in his tribe and in other Aboriginal groups. And these things would scare the living dog shit out of your American wimpy ass upper middle class suburbanite, right? 2 weeks of dire, scary stuff, sometimes more, both for the men and the women. These are young, 13, 14. And there's, repeated initiations at different parts of your life, at different ages, coming of age, getting married, becoming a full, mature adult, etc. And the fact that we don't have these kinds of really intense and indeed scary initiation processes in our society strikes me as one of the things that contributes to this fragility of young folks today. And education should certainly include some of that. One of the great programs there is Outward Bound, right, which has been a long time program. It takes people die on Outward Bound trips, right? And I've never been on an Outward Bound trip, but I've done some outdoor shit where there was a chance we could have died. We didn't. Good, right? But having had those experiences actually makes you a much more resilient person. Sitting in your upper middle class suburbia. What a ridiculous thing! The number of 12-year-olds who had never been out of the presence of an adult in their life. I go, what? It's like some 30-40% of 12-year-olds had never been out of the presence of an adult in their life. When we were kids, they just turned us loose, at 9 o'clock in the morning, come back for dinner. And what we did, better they didn't know, right? And so I suspect and this is Haight's and Lubinoff's point in the coddling of the American mind, is that we have really done a huge disservice to our young people by not allowing to have challenging and downright dangerous experiences.
There's different plausible sources of that fragility, right? Some is the way we're parenting. Some is the The fact that a lot of people are living in urban environments and don't have to encounter any of the complexities and stresses of interacting with nature and animals and tasks and wildernesses. There's also a kind of argument about whether we've been infected by a philosophy or infected by a perverse set of economic incentives. I mentioned Creston Davis, who I talked to a little while ago from the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and they're trying to leverage cryptocurrencies and make their programs debt-free and things like that. And his concern about the University of Austin and similar projects is that unless you reform the financing approaches, you'll end up binding that education into those perverse game A dynamics, regardless of your intention and regardless of the caliber of your teachers. And he's thinking about this sort of fragility, not so much as the result of a philosophy like, oh, we all read too much European continental philosophy in the 1960s, and now we have the wrong educational approach. He's thinking about the gradual undermining of the educational system by the economic incentives to the point where we're basically just serving economically leveraged customers. And because the customer is always right, then it becomes a hive of fragility that contaminates the rest of the society.
Yeah, so that's a very good point.
I'm curious how important you think a change in the economics of education is.
I think gigantic. Consider it an elite education. Well, first I'm going to step back and say, let's take a comparative perspective. So I think we're seeing some of the same zaniness and fragility even in Europe, where costs of education are zero in many cases. So there's also a cultural component of it, but it's probably worse in the U.S. And so I would expect there's the cultural component plus the economic component. I doubt it's either, and the two seem to be reinforcing each other in particularly perverse ways in the USA at the present time. To go to a 4-year undergraduate education at elite university today, $300,000. What the fuck, right? When I was an undergraduate at MIT, I was scrapping working class kind of dude, had to work my way through a little bit of debt, a little bit of work study, a little bit of scholarship, and a little bit from myself and my parents. It was $16,000, right? Even after adjusting for inflation, that's about $65,000. So an elite education in the United States now 5 times as expensive after adjusting for inflation. And that is a grotesque force field. And I know lots of millennials who I've gotten to know through my Game B work and also through my work in regenerative agriculture. And those who have not been smart in avoiding student debt are literally crushed by it, right? They're now moving into many of them in their late 30s, and they're still paying, significant parts of their income on student debt, which keeps them from doing the kind of work that they would really love to do. And it's just a horrible thumb on their spirit, right? And I suppose, to the customer's always right. If you're paying $300,000 a year, you better get what you want, right? So 300,000 for 4 years, you're going to get what you want. So I would say that that's utterly insane, bad, crazy, and we probably talk for an hour on how we got to that point. But it's certainly not about value. If the cost of education, and I could tell you this, I am involved in some of the governance at MIT, so I can actually see how the sausage is made at the Brain and Cognitive Science Department, where I'm on the board of visitors. And the education is no better than it was in 1975, and it's 5 times more expensive after controlling for inflation. So something's gone very badly wrong there. And I think that another real big issue is that we have combined 2 things which don't belong in the same box. One is training for a career, a calling, or a craft, and the general education of the person and the citizen, right? So people go to Stanford, take computer science, and then go, work in some tech company building websites. Well, let me tell you, you can learn how to build websites in 6 months under the tutelage of someone that knows how to build websites, and you can become very, very good at it in 2 or 3 years, being paid the whole while. So an awful lot of what we call career calling craft work ought to really move to an apprenticeship model. If you're somebody who really wants to, say, learn how to be a software web UI designer, start when you're 16, part-time, work, study, being paid, and not being paid a lot, probably being paid, $10 an hour. But you're not paying anybody else, and you're getting really good education in practical things, and your work is actually going out into the world as the products that are being created. And I think that applies to a tremendous amount of career calling and craft things, probably most of them. But then they also try to commingle the liberal arts distributed education component in it. That's partially how they justify these ridiculous prices. And that can easily be done informally under, let's say, a teacherly authority. You sign up with Layman Pascal, who you talk with for half an hour twice a month on what you're reading, what you're thinking, maybe what you should read next. Guess what? That doesn't cost $300,000 either. And you combine the two, and you're not in debt at all. You've been making money since you're 16 years old. You're learning really practically what your craft or career or your calling is all about. And you have this amazing guru, Layman Pascal, who you talk to twice a month for half an hour, who has been guiding you in your reading and your thinking and has been referring you to other sources, et cetera. Now, why isn't that a hell of a lot better model that doesn't put people under the thumb of game A economics?
There's a whole set of perverse value exchanges here. Like, are you getting the education you're paying for? Well, clearly not if you're paying way more for the same education. And likewise, are you getting, how much education are we getting for the amount of time that's being put in? We touched on this at the beginning. I know in the United States now, there seems to be a lot of bipartisan consensus around universal pre-K, which, maybe if your home life is not as socially sophisticated as the school, okay, maybe parents need that extra year or two of free daycare. But it seems like the presumption is that more institutional education over longer periods is necessarily better. And that seems really dubious because it doesn't address the problem of how much are we getting for what. There was a book a couple of years ago, there was a great book called The Smartest Kids in the World. And what it did was it followed American exchange students going to the countries that score highest on international education and exchange students from those countries coming to the United States. And at the time, it was Poland, Finland, and South Korea. And the woman who wrote the book talked to the South Korean education minister, and he said, "We have a terrible education system." And she said, "What do you mean? You score really high?" He said, "Our students go to school longer than anyone else, and they all have private tutors after the fact." So he's like, we're not getting good results for the amount of effort we're putting in. And that seems like a really huge uninspected problem.
Yeah. And it's an opportunity cost, right? If, as we talked earlier, the really rich things you need to learn, you learned at recess and in unstructured play. If you're a South Korean kid who's just ground to dust with, after school cram schools and all this sort of stuff, you don't have any room at all for this unstructured play. And, I know some Korean people, I love them, but shall we say, I wish they had more time for unstructured play. I'll leave it there at that. So that's the other cost, right? And, to this universal pre-K, again, these are unfortunately how we've organized our society, and this is game A-ism. If your status comes through having fancy cars, big house, or living in a fancy neighborhood, and both husband and wife have to work at the limit of their economic earning capacity to hold the status through possessions and positional goods in place, then custodial care of the children is helpful. But if we lived in a game B society where status through possessions and positional goods was not what we organized our life around, and instead we organized around human well-being, we would not be all having to operate at the absolute cutting edge of our economic maximum. And we'd have a much richer, organic, on-the-ground community where, again, we could have children engaged in free play and free self-organizing activities. I famously refused to go to kindergarten. In those days, it was optional. I think it is still actually optional in many states, but relatively few people just put their foot down and said, "No, I'm not going." And when I heard about what they allegedly taught in kindergarten, I said, because they wouldn't let you, in those days, they didn't teach reading and writing. I already knew how to read and write. And they made you take naps. And I had stopped taking naps when I was 2. And I was like, God damn, if I'm going to go do finger painting and take naps, fuck that. And so I literally put my foot down and said, nope, not going to kindergarten. And I basically had an extra year of independent play and organizing building of tree forts and playing pickup games and just hanging out. And I never regretted not going to kindergarten. I can tell you that.
Yeah, that stuff provided a kid has access to the spaces and opportunities to do those things. It seems like those other free range activities are the ones that build up the proto skills that they're going to need for educational performance down the road. One of the things that pops into my head here that really interests me is the sort of anticipated world that an educational process is aimed at. Like if it's, that sort of 19th century American German idea that we're producing the factory workers, or, even today we're like, oh, we're going to need more computer programmers. We're going to need more whatever. We're anticipating a world and we're producing people for the world we think is going to exist. But at the same time, the mid 21st century seems like such an unstable, unpredictable period of time, where ecological and economic and technological and social factors, and any one of which could radically transform the situation. And we see people around the world really feeling like they can't trust and predict anymore what it's going to be like very soon. So if that's the world we're anticipating, how do we train people for instability, for a non-specific, highly disruptible near future? Like, what's the education for that niche?
Yeah, Barry, that's a really good point. Of course, it's a truism, right? Anyone who's a technologist, what they learned in college is obsolete within 6 or 7 years, and at least a bit. In 10 years, it's almost passé. And some deep principles, but an awful lot of the superficials are irrelevant. So clearly, in a rapidly evolving world, the ability to learn has to come up. The ability to learn in a lifetime sense has got to be a core skill, right? Because you're going to have to reinvent yourself multiple times. And I think that's hugely important. And that's where this distinction between career calling and craft learning on one side and educated person, citizen learning on the other are really two different things. Career calling and craft, you need to be productive in the craft as it exists today, but also be taught the general principles that allows you to evolve as the craft evolves. And some crafts do evolve and some don't. Bricklaying isn't all that different than it was in the days of the Romans, while let's say doing animations rather different than it was being done with paintbrushes and stuff not all that long ago. So the degree that you want to build that into the career calling and craft depends on the craft. But in terms of the other side of it, the educated person, citizen, lifetime learning has certainly got to be something that's part of that, because you may decide to change your career calling or craft, right? Or you may be a person who decides to spend most of their work doing community service that's not really anything having much to do with economic optimization. And so that's where that second side of the education, they should be thought of as two separate things. Today, we kind of got them all commingled and confused and not doing a good job on either.
So if we separate those and we put the craft training to one side and look at what the general education consists of, right? There's a certain number of regular modules that we have today that we think of as general education, right? Reading and writing and arithmetic and phys ed, things like that. Phys ed actually is interesting to me because, yes, obviously you're going to do better if you have physical exercise every day. But there's not much. When I went to school, there was no ed in phys ed. It's very bizarre that you can take a physical education class for 12 years and walk away not knowing where your pancreas is or what vitamins you need in order to survive. Like, I learned nothing about physiology.
Yeah, exactly. Mine was the same. It was just, playing games, basically, which was good.
The question is, what should the basic modules be? What does the general education have to include? I always think that hedonics, or the ability to regulate yourself and other people for pleasures of various kinds, is a hugely important thing for living a meaningful quality of life with other people, not touched on in the school system at all. What would you add in as modules of basic education?
Wow, damn. Again, I'm not an expert in this domain. I haven't necessarily spent that much time thinking about it. So again, I'm just making this shit up.
Sure.
I think one of some of the things that we touched upon before, the basic cognitive skills of things like attention and coherence and group interaction When you can decompose them from their content, right? And actually get down to the basic cognitive skills that you need to do these kinds of things. Hedonics, yeah, that's of course going to be controversial, right? And I think if you're going to go in those directions, it has to be very local. Get back to the question before. Teaching hedonics at the level of 7 million people and finding consensus on what was a reasonable thing to do ain't never going to happen. On the other hand, having a specific point of view from 150 people, I think you could probably do some interesting things there. In terms of interesting point about physical education. Now, I would separate things that don't belong together. I think organized play and physical competence and fitness are a thing, but they're a different thing than learning about good nutrition, getting enough sleep and things of that sort. So I would add to the curriculum somewhere some education on human physical and mental well-being from a scientific perspective, which, as you point out, at least in my day, we didn't have any of that. They may have more of it today. I don't really know. So that would be certainly important. The other one that you don't see much of is real education in creativity. Now, sometimes you get it secondhand through art or music classes, but frankly, not very much. And in our emerging world, creativity is going to be at an increasing premium. And so exercises specifically around, using creativity and as far out of the box as you can get, I think would be a really good thing to add. And then the other one, particularly this is huge, actually, as we live in this fucked up virtual information sphere, learning how to think clearly about analyzing arguments, though, being actually able to use the 50 known cognitive fallacies, right, and apply them would probably have more yield in terms of happy people and good citizenship than almost anything else I can think of.
Yeah, I didn't get any instruction on biases and fallacies until university, and that
I didn't even get it then.
Long. And it seems to me like that's maybe a subset of general information skills, right? Because we have media literacy problems. We have, how do you deal with bullshit? How do you find good information sources? How do you do all the sense-making stuff that our communities are always talking about? How do you approach information in a world now where anything can be fake? In a world of deep fakes, how do you instruct children about how to deal with information?
Yep. And just the simplest thing, I happen to be really good at this. I don't know why. I guess because I've been doing it since before it existed, is knowing how to Google, right? It would be well worth a 2 or 3 hour arc when people are, say, 10 or 11 on how to Google, how to use this amazing tool, but not be misled by it and not go down rabbit holes. And as you say, how to discern what's bullshit and what's not. Those right now are skills of the highest order, which I don't know of being taught in schools.
How do we strike the balance? There's not really an answer to this between the virtual and the embodied, because clearly there's a huge role for online education, but just the same, it gets vastly exaggerated, especially in pandemics and especially in a looming Zuckerberg metaverse. There's going to be a real temptation to export a lot of this into virtual electronic environments. And there's obviously some utility to that, but we're also going to lose a lot of the things that come from embodied interaction if we do too much of that. How do we get the best of both worlds there?
Yeah, that's something Zach talks about a fair bit. He's not an anti-technologist, but he talks about the fact that it needs to be put in a broader context that includes these other elements. And in fact, done correctly, some of the virtual might actually be able to allow you to have more time for free play. Let's say you can learn math better by doing it when you're cognitively ready and doing the Khan Academy virtual lectures, and learn how to do your basic manipulative math 3 times more effectively than listening to a relatively incompetent second, third, and fourth grade teacher try to teach you this stuff with a bunch of jabbering kids all around you. If indeed that turns out to be the way to do it, then you should do that, right? But then you should have the macro analysis, okay, of the time and efforts we're spending in education. We've suddenly learned that you should teach math a little later, and we should teach it via the Khan Academy, let's say, just as an example. And that frees up a tremendous amount of time. Let's not use that for even more virtual. Let's use that time for the non-virtual, for the embodied, for learning your craft or your calling, learning how to play freely and imaginatively, learning how to do dance, learning how to do tricks on your bicycle, right? All the things that are just so rich. And so to the degree we can get efficiency gains and effectiveness gains from technology, let's not make the mistake of then using that as an excuse to have even more virtual and technology. Let's say thanks for the win, and then let's use that time for the things that make you for a much more balanced human being.
I feel like we could talk about this topic for a long time. I'm also aware there's only a limited amount of time anybody's going to pay attention to a given podcast, so we're probably coming to the end. Is there... First of all, let me say, anybody who's out there listening who is part of the liminal web or the Game Beat community or any of those kinds of things, this is a conversation that seems like it's just getting started, that we need to come to some kind of clarity about the educational principles that would be involved, and we need to really start trying to instantiate some improved educational projects so that we can have those emerge together in tandem with proto-bees and new civilization attempts. Is there... For you, Jim, have you said everything you wanted to say, or is there anything you've been thinking about education that hasn't come up yet?
I think we covered a lot of it. Again, I think I would finish off with, to your point, it's time to actually start trying things non-dogmatically, right? Realizing we're very early and there's been some great thinking, but those of us who have built things know that thinking and design, when they encounter the real world, often you learn things. And so I would say it's time to start doing it, but do it with ideas maybe strongly stated but loosely held, empirically, and with the realization that whatever we're doing first is almost certainly not entirely correct, and being able to adapt relatively rapidly.
Amen. Let's start trying things. Jim Rutt, everybody.
Great to be back here with you, Layman, and always an interesting and invigorating conversation.